The grand ballroom of the Hartwell estate was dazzling, every surface shimmering under the glow of ornate chandeliers. Socialites in floor-length gowns and tailored tuxedos swirled about, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries that felt polished but hollow. For Claire Sullivan, who stood in the corner with a clipboard clutched tightly to her chest, the scene was both mesmerizing and exhausting. She adjusted her glasses and made a mental note to check on the catering staff again. Evelyn Hartwell would demand nothing less than perfection. "Claire. Over here." Evelyn's voice cut through the din, sharp and commanding. Claire turned swiftly, navigating her way through the crowd with practiced grace. Evelyn, resplendent in a crimson gown that likely cost more than Claire's annual salary, gestured for her assistant to lean in. "I've had the most delightful idea." "You're going to love this," Evelyn purred, though her words were clearly more for her own amusement. "Yes, Miss Hartwell?" Claire's tone was polite but wary. Experience had taught her that Evelyn's delightful ideas often came at someone else's expense. "You see that stage over there?" Evelyn gestured toward the small platform at the far end of the room, where a live band played jazz standards. "That's where the charity dance competition will happen at the next gala. And guess who's going to represent me in it?" Evelyn's eyes gleamed mischievously. Claire felt her stomach tighten. "I'm not sure I understand." Evelyn waved a manicured hand, dismissing her hesitation. "You, Claire. It's perfect. My assistant will be my dark horse. Imagine the laughs when they see you, no offense, darling, fumbling around in the competition. It'll be hysterical." Claire's cheeks flushed, a mix of embarrassment and indignation threatening to bubble over. But years of working for Evelyn had taught her how to mask her emotions. "I don't know if that's a good idea," she said carefully, her voice barely audible over the music. "Nonsense. It's all for a good cause. Besides, you can't say no. I'm your boss." Evelyn's laughter tinkled like the clink of champagne glasses. Before Claire could respond, Evelyn clapped her hands to draw attention, silencing the room in an instant. "Ladies and gentlemen," Evelyn announced with a theatrical flourish, "I have an exciting announcement. My very own assistant, Claire Sullivan, will be participating in our charity dance competition next month. Let's give her a round of applause for being such a good sport." The room erupted in polite applause, and all eyes turned to Claire. She froze, the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. She wanted to sink into the floor, but Evelyn's gaze pinned her in place. With no other option, Claire forced a small, awkward smile and gave a half-hearted wave. As the applause faded and the crowd resumed their chatter, Evelyn leaned in once more. "You'll be fine, darling. Just find a dance partner and take a lesson or two. Think of it as character building." With that, she sashayed away to mingle with her guests, leaving Claire standing alone, her mind racing. She barely had time to process what had just happened when Evelyn's driver, Colin, appeared by her side, a look of mild panic on his face. "Miss Hartwell needs to leave immediately," he said in a low voice. "There's been some kind of emergency." "What kind of emergency?" Claire asked, her professional instincts kicking in. Colin shook his head. "She didn't say. Just asked for the car to be ready." Claire frowned but nodded. She followed Colin to the exit, where Evelyn was already slipping on her coat. "I'll leave you to handle things here, Claire," Evelyn said briskly. "Make sure everything runs smoothly. Oh, and don't forget, practice those dance moves. I'll check in tomorrow." And with that, Evelyn disappeared into the night, leaving Claire to manage the event, and her newfound predicament, alone. As the evening wore on, Claire went through the motions of ensuring the gala's success, but her mind was elsewhere. She replayed Evelyn's announcement over and over, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. A dance competition? In front of all those people? She had no formal training, no idea where to even begin. And yet, backing out wasn't an option. Not with Evelyn's reputation, and her own job, on the line. By the time the last guest had departed and the catering team was packing up, Claire was exhausted. She sank into one of the empty chairs, her clipboard forgotten on the table. The once bustling ballroom was now eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the cleaning crew. She closed her eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. Maybe, she thought, it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe she could find a partner, take a few lessons, and muddle through it. Or maybe she would trip over her own feet and become the laughingstock of the city. The thought made her stomach churn. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, one of the musicians approached her. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone light but sympathetic. Claire looked up and managed a weak smile. "You could say that." "I saw what happened earlier," he said, leaning on his saxophone case. "Pretty bold move, volunteering like that." Claire gave a small laugh, though it lacked humor. "I wouldn't call it volunteering." "Well," he said, straightening up, "if you need any help, I know a guy. Great dancer, owes me a favor. I can introduce you." Claire hesitated. The idea of reaching out to a stranger for help felt daunting, but then again, what choice did she have? "That might actually be really helpful," she admitted. The musician grinned. "I'll set it up. Don't worry, you've got this." As he walked away, Claire felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. For now, that would have to be enough. Claire spent the next 2 days trying to balance her usual workload while discreetly avoiding all of Evelyn's calls she could manage without raising attention. Each ring of her phone was like an ominous drumbeat, a reminder that her time to prepare for the dance competition was slipping away. She had no idea where to begin. Every option she considered led back to the same conclusion: she needed help. She replayed the conversation with the musician from the gala in her mind, the one who had promised to introduce her to a dancer. It felt like a long shot, but desperation outweighed her doubts. That evening, she sent a text to the number he had given her. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a response. "Meet me at Starlight Studio, 6 p.m. tomorrow. Jake Daniels." The name meant nothing to Claire, but she felt a flicker of relief. Whoever this Jake was, he had to be better at dancing than she was. The following evening, Claire arrived at the studio, an unassuming building tucked between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner. She stepped inside, immediately overwhelmed by the sight of mirrored walls, polished floors, and people gliding effortlessly across the room in perfect synchronization. Her stomach knotted. This was so far out of her element she felt like an imposter just standing there. "Claire Sullivan?" A voice cut through her thoughts, startling her. She turned to see a man approaching, a tall, confident figure with sharp features and an air of easy charm. He wore a fitted black t-shirt and joggers, his posture relaxed but self-assured. "Yes, that's me," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Jake Daniels," he introduced himself, extending a hand. His handshake was firm, his smile faintly amused. "So, you're the charity case?" Claire blinked, unsure if she had misheard him. "Excuse me?" Jake smirked, clearly enjoying her reaction. "Relax, it's just an expression. Word is you've never danced a day in your life and need to pull off a miracle for this competition. Am I wrong?" Claire straightened her back, her embarrassment quickly replaced by irritation. "I wouldn't call it a miracle. I'm just out of practice." Jake raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Right. Well, we've got a month to turn you into someone who won't trip over their own feet. Let's get started." Without waiting for her response, he walked toward the center of the room, motioning for her to follow. Claire hesitated, then took a deep breath and joined him. If she was going to do this, she would need to leave her pride at the door. "First things first," Jake said, clapping his hands together. "Let's see what we're working with. Show me what you've got." Claire stared at him, horrified. You want me to dance? Right now? Why not? He said with a shrug. I need to know where you're starting from. She opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. Arguing wouldn't help. She placed her bag on the floor, adjusted her posture awkwardly, and tried to recall the few dance moves she had picked up at weddings over the years. After a few seconds of shuffling and half-hearted twirls, she stopped, her cheeks burning. Jake stood there, arms crossed, clearly holding back a laugh. Well, that was something. Are you always this encouraging? She shot back, folding her arms. Look, I'm not here to sugarcoat things, Jake said, his tone softening slightly. You've got a lot of work to do, but I've seen worse. Gee, thanks, Claire muttered. He stepped closer, his expression turning serious. Here's the deal. I'll teach you, but you have to commit. No half measures, no excuses. If you're not willing to work for it, you're wasting both our time. Deal? Claire hesitated. Jake's bluntness was grating, but she couldn't deny he had a point. She needed someone who wouldn't let her off the hook. Deal. Good. Now, let's start with the basics. The next hour was a blur of missteps, corrections, and the occasional exasperated sigh from Jake. He moved with effortless precision, demonstrating each step with the kind of grace that made it look easy. Claire, on the other hand, felt like a newborn giraffe, clumsy, uncoordinated, and painfully aware of her lack of rhythm. Left foot, then right, Jake said for the third time, his tone patient but firm. No, your other left. Claire groaned, rubbing her temples. This is impossible. It's not impossible, Jake said, his voice unusually gentle. It's just new. Everyone starts somewhere. She looked at him, surprised by the shift in his demeanor. For a moment, she saw something beyond the cocky exterior, a glimpse of someone who understood what it felt like to struggle. They practiced for another hour, and though Claire's movements were still far from graceful, she began to notice small improvements. Her steps felt a little more confident, her posture a little steadier. Jake even offered the occasional nod of approval, which felt like a victory in itself. By the end of the session, Claire was exhausted but oddly exhilarated. She sank onto a bench, gulping down water as Jake joined her. You did better than I expected, he admitted, handing her a towel. High praise, she said dryly, but she couldn't hide her smile. Thanks for not giving up on me. Jake shrugged, a faint grin tugging at his lips. You've got more fight in you than I thought. That's half the battle. As Claire gathered her things to leave, Jake stopped her. Same time tomorrow? She hesitated, then nodded. I'll be here. Walking out of the studio, Claire felt a strange mix of exhaustion and excitement. For the first time since Evelyn had thrown her into this mess, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could pull it off. The morning air was crisp as Claire stepped into the Hartwell estate, her heels clicking against the marble floors. The usual hum of activity felt different today, quieter, yet somehow charged, like a storm brewing just out of sight. She made her way to her desk, setting down her bag and pulling out her planner. But the low murmurs from Evelyn's office immediately caught her attention. Her colleagues whispered in tight clusters, their voices hushed but animated. Claire caught snippets as she walked by. Did you hear? She left the gala in such a rush. They're saying it's a lawsuit. Something big. She's been on the phone all morning. Claire frowned, her curiosity piqued. Evelyn had always been the epitome of control, never one to let anything interfere with her carefully constructed image. For her to leave the gala so abruptly meant whatever had happened must have been serious. Before Claire could process further, Evelyn's voice rang out from her office, sharp and commanding. Claire! In here. Now. Straightening her shoulders, Claire entered the office to find Evelyn pacing behind her desk, a phone pressed to her ear. Her usually flawless demeanor was slightly frayed, though she hid it well under a mask of indignation. "Good, you're here," Evelyn said, barely glancing at her as she gestured for Claire to sit. "I need you to handle the press inquiries. And for God's sake, tell them I'm unavailable." Claire nodded, pulling out her notepad. "What should I say if they ask about?" "Don't be dense, Claire," Evelyn snapped. "Deflect. We don't confirm or deny anything. Use your head." Claire bit her tongue, nodding silently as Evelyn returned her focus to the phone call. The tension in the room was suffocating. After taking a few notes, Claire excused herself, but her curiosity burned hotter. She had to know what was going on. The answer came an hour later when she saw the news alerts on her phone. Headlines blared Evelyn Hartwell's name alongside accusations of breach of contract and financial misconduct. The lawsuit, filed by a former business partner, alleged mismanagement of funds on a high-profile project. The speculation was relentless, and social media had turned it into a feeding frenzy. Claire scrolled through post after post, the sharp barbs of public opinion cutting through Evelyn's once pristine image. Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't just a minor PR hiccup, this was a full-blown scandal. She knew Evelyn would do whatever it took to protect her reputation, but she couldn't imagine how. Later that afternoon, as Claire returned from the copier with a stack of documents, she passed Evelyn's office again. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, Evelyn was speaking to someone in a low, urgent tone. Claire hesitated, unsure if she should interrupt, but her curiosity rooted her in place. "You're telling me there's no way to shut this down quietly?" Evelyn's voice was sharp, edged with frustration. A man's voice, calm and measured, responded. "The suit is public record. The best we can do is shift the narrative." Evelyn let out a sharp exhale. "Then that's exactly what we'll do. The competition is in a week, and it's perfect. By then, everyone will forget about the lawsuit because they'll be too busy talking about Claire." Claire froze. Her name? She leaned in slightly, her heart pounding. Evelyn continued, her voice dripping with calculated malice. "It's all set up. She'll embarrass herself on stage. She doesn't have the talent to pull this off. The media will eat it up." Evelyn Hartwell's assistant falls flat on her face. "That's the headline they'll be running. And by the time they're done laughing at her, they won't care about my legal troubles." The lawyer spoke again, his tone more cautious. "And if she doesn't fail?" Evelyn scoffed. "She will. Claire's not capable of succeeding at something like this. Besides, even if by some miracle she does well, I'll handle her after the fact. One way or another, this competition will work in my favor." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. She stepped back from the door, clutching the papers in her hand as her mind raced. Evelyn wasn't just indifferent about her participation, she was banking on Claire's failure. It wasn't about charity or entertainment, it was a calculated move to use Claire as a scapegoat. The betrayal hit her like a tidal wave. Claire had always known Evelyn could be ruthless, but to hear her coldly plotting against her was something else entirely. She felt sick to her stomach, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. If she failed at the competition, she'd be humiliated in front of everyone, and Evelyn would come out unscathed. But if she somehow succeeded, she'd still face Evelyn's wrath and likely lose her job. The dance studio was quiet, the soft hum of the stereo playing in the background as Claire laced up her shoes. Jake was already there, stretching by the mirrored wall, but his usual grin was replaced with a look of quiet focus. He watched her for a moment before crossing the room. "You're early," he said lightly. "Trying to get a head start?" Claire shook her head, her movements slower than usual. "Just needed to clear my head." Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't press. They started the warm-up in near silence, the atmosphere heavier than it had been in weeks. Claire's steps were half-hearted, her focus elsewhere, and Jake finally stopped the music, crossing his arms as he looked at her. "Okay, what's going on?" he asked. And don't say nothing, because I'm not buying it. Claire hesitated, the weight of Evelyn's plan pressing down on her chest. She hadn't told anyone, not because she didn't want to, but because saying it out loud would make it feel more real. But Jake's steady gaze softened her resolve. I overheard Evelyn talking to her lawyer, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She's counting on me to fail at the competition. She thinks if I embarrass myself, it'll distract everyone from her legal issues. Jake's jaw tightened, and he let out a low whistle. That's ruthless. Even for Evelyn. Claire nodded, her throat tightening. I don't know what to do. If I fail, I'll be humiliated. If I succeed, she'll probably fire me. Either way, I lose. Jake leaned back against the wall, folding his arms. I get it, he said after a moment. More than you think. Claire frowned, confused. What do you mean? Jake hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I've been where you are. A few years ago, I was at the top of my game, a big-shot dancer with sponsors, awards, all of it. Then I made one mistake. I got cocky, pushed too hard, and injured myself in the middle of a major competition. It was bad, public, messy. I lost everything. Claire stared at him, her chest tightening. She hadn't known. What happened? Jake shrugged, his expression distant. People love a comeback story, but only after they've watched you fall. For a while, I thought I'd never get back on my feet. But then I realized something. Losing everything doesn't mean you've lost yourself. I had to decide how I wanted to move forward, not for anyone else, but for me. His words lingered in the air between them, striking a chord in Claire's chest. She wanted to ask more, to dig deeper into his story, but something in his expression told her this wasn't the time. Instead, she nodded, her voice soft. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do that. Jake stepped closer, his gaze steady. You are. You just don't know it yet. The question isn't whether you can, it's whether you want to. How do you want to feel when you wake up the next morning? Do you want to know you gave it everything, or that you let someone else decide your worth? The words hit harder than Claire expected, her chest tightening. She wanted to believe him, to feel that strength he seemed to see in her. But the doubts lingered, clinging to her like shadows. Jake studied her for a moment, then smiled softly. Come on. We're done for tonight. What? Claire asked, startled. But we haven't even started the routine. Exactly, Jake said, grabbing his bag. You don't need more practice. You need a break. Trust me. Before Claire could protest, they were sitting in a booth at a retro-style diner, the scent of fresh milkshakes and grilled burgers filling the air. Jake grinned as the server placed a tall glass with 2 straws between them. Best milkshakes in town, he said, nudging the glass toward her. You can't be stressed with a milkshake in front of you. Claire laughed despite herself, the tension in her chest easing slightly. She took a sip, the sweet chocolate flavor a small comfort. This is your big plan to fix my problems? Hey, don't knock it until it works, Jake said, leaning back. Besides, it's not about fixing anything. It's about remembering there's more to life than one competition. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing naturally as they shared pieces of their lives. Jake told her about growing up in a family that didn't understand his love for dance, and the challenges of proving himself in an industry that demanded perfection. Claire opened up about her mother, the way she used to dance with her in their tiny living room, and how those memories were both comforting and bittersweet. There was a moment, as Jake talked about rebuilding his life after his fall from grace, that their eyes met. It wasn't a grand moment, but it felt significant, like a silent acknowledgement of the connection they shared. Neither of them said anything about it, both seemingly understanding that some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. As they walked back to the car, Claire felt lighter than she had in days. Jake turned to her with a small smile. Feeling better? Yeah, Claire admitted. Thanks for this. Anytime, Jake said. Just remember, you're not in this alone. The next morning, the buzz around the competition grew louder. Social media was flooded with speculation about whether Claire would rise to the challenge or crumble under pressure. Evelyn's remarks became more pointed, her passive-aggressive encouragement thinly veiling her hope for disaster. You're going to shine at the competition, Claire, Evelyn said with a saccharine smile. I just know it. Claire forced a tight smile, her determination stealing. She wouldn't give Evelyn the satisfaction of breaking her spirit. That evening at the studio, the atmosphere shifted. Claire and Jake moved through the routine with a renewed sense of purpose, their movements sharper and more in sync than ever before. The unspoken connection between them deepened, a silent understanding that they were both fighting for something bigger than a trophy. As the night wore on, Jake stopped the music and turned to her, his expression serious but kind. You've got this, Claire. I've seen it. Now you just need to believe it. The competition hall buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with excitement and nerves. Claire stood backstage, peeking out from behind the curtain at the sea of elegantly dressed attendees and judges seated under the glow of dazzling chandeliers. The grandeur of the moment only amplified her anxiety, her pulse quickening as the MC announced the lineup. She adjusted her dress for what felt like the 10th time, her fingers trembling as she tried to focus. Every fiber of her being felt the weight of the night, the expectations of the audience, Evelyn's manipulative presence lingering like a shadow, and the gnawing fear of failing in front of everyone. She glanced toward the crowd and caught a glimpse of Evelyn in the front row, her expression unreadable but her gaze sharp. Claire's stomach twisted. Hey. Jake's voice was soft but grounding as he approached. He held something small in his hand, and the faintest smile played on his lips. I thought you could use this. Claire looked down as he opened his palm, revealing a delicate silver pin shaped like a star. It glimmered under the backstage lights, simple yet beautiful. For your hair, he said, stepping closer. For luck. Her chest tightened, the gesture catching her off guard. Jake, you didn't have to. I wanted to, he interrupted gently. You've worked too hard to let tonight scare you. And just so you know, you're going to be incredible. She swallowed hard as he brushed a loose strand of hair back and secured the pin in place. When their eyes met, time seemed to pause. His usual playful confidence was gone, replaced with something softer, something unspoken but deeply felt. For a moment, the crowd, the stage, and Evelyn all faded away. Claire felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake smiled, his hand lingering near her cheek for just a moment before he stepped back. Let's go show them what we've got. The MC's voice boomed through the speakers, announcing their names as the next performers. The applause swelled, and Claire felt her nerves spike again. Jake offered his hand, his eyes steady and reassuring. She took it, drawing strength from his calm as they walked onto the stage together. The lights were blinding, the audience a blur of faces in the dimly lit room. Claire positioned herself, her breath catching as the opening notes of their music filled the space. Jake gave her a subtle nod, and they began. The routine started with a slight stumble. Claire's foot slipped during the first turn, her heart leaping into her throat. But Jake's hands were there instantly, steadying her and guiding her back into the flow of the dance. The moment passed quickly, and she focused on the rhythm, on the movements they had practiced so many times. With every step, the music carried them forward, their chemistry unfolding like a story for the audience to see. Jake lifted her effortlessly into the air, their timing perfect as they moved through the intricate sequence. Each spin, each step felt more confident, their connection driving the energy of the performance. Claire let herself get lost in the moment, her fears dissolving as she gave herself over to the dance. By the time they reached the final pose, the music swelling to its crescendo, Claire felt the audience's energy shift. Applause erupted even before the last note finished, the sound roaring through the hall like a wave. She froze in place, breathless and overwhelmed, as Jake held her steady. His eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the room. The crowd rose to its feet, their cheers and applause filling the space. Claire's heart pounded, a mixture of exhilaration and disbelief coursing through her. They had done it. Not just performed, but triumphed. As the judges took the stage to announce the winners, Claire felt Jake's hand brush against hers. It was a small gesture, but it grounded her in the whirlwind of emotion. When their names were called as the champions, the hall erupted once more, the applause and cheers echoing in her ears. Claire barely registered the moment the trophy was handed to them, her focus entirely on Jake. He turned to her, his grin wide and unrestrained. The tension, the nerves, and the weeks of preparation all melted away in the warmth of his gaze. And then, without thinking, she leaned in. Jake met her halfway, their lips finding each other in a kiss that felt like the culmination of everything they had shared, every late-night practice, every whispered encouragement, every unspoken feeling. The crowd's cheers grew louder, their excitement a perfect mirror of the joy Claire felt. When they finally pulled back, Claire couldn't help but laugh, her cheeks flushed. Jake's smile was brighter than ever, his hand firm around hers as they held the trophy together. The applause still echoed in the grand ballroom as Claire and Jake stepped off the stage, the trophy heavy in her hands but her heart feeling impossibly light. The crowd was still buzzing with energy, their performance the highlight of the evening. Claire could barely keep the smile off her face, her gaze flitting to Jake every few seconds as if to confirm the moment was real. Then Evelyn's voice cut through the noise like a shard of glass. "Claire," she barked, her tone cold enough to send a chill down Claire's spine. The triumphant bubble burst. Claire turned slowly to face Evelyn, who was striding toward her, heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Her expression was a mix of fury and disbelief, her perfectly applied lipstick slightly smudged from what Claire could only assume was gritted teeth. "You have some nerve," Evelyn hissed, stopping just inches away. Her voice wasn't loud, but the venom in her tone was impossible to miss. "Do you think this is your moment? That you deserve this spotlight? You were supposed to represent me, not make me look irrelevant." Claire took a steadying breath, her fingers tightening around the trophy. "I didn't do this to outshine you, Evelyn. I did this because I worked hard, and I wanted to prove to myself that I could." Evelyn's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Don't play innocent. You've embarrassed me in front of my peers. Stealing the spotlight like this is beyond unprofessional. You're fired." Gasps rippled through the nearby crowd, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop but were now blatantly staring. Claire felt their eyes on her, the weight of the moment pressing down. But instead of crumbling, she lifted her chin, her voice calm and clear. "I knew this was coming. And you know what? It's fine." Evelyn blinked, momentarily thrown off. "Excuse me? I don't need this job to define me," Claire said, holding her head high. "Not anymore." Before Evelyn could recover, Jake stepped forward, his hand finding the small of Claire's back. "You ready to go?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Claire nodded, turning away from Evelyn without another word. She felt lighter with every step, the trophy still clutched tightly in her hands as Jake guided her through the crowd. Whispers followed them, but Claire didn't care. She felt truly free. The ride to Claire's apartment was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Jake's hand rested casually on the gear shift, his occasional glances her way filled with something unspoken yet unmistakable. Claire clutched the trophy in her lap, her emotions a swirl of relief, exhaustion, and something she couldn't quite name. When they reached her building, Jake parked and turned to her. "You sure you're okay?" Claire smiled, her fingers brushing the edge of the trophy. "I'm better than okay. Thanks to you. You did this," he said firmly. "I just helped you see it." They stepped out into the cool night, the city lights casting a soft glow as they made their way inside. Claire's apartment felt small and warm after the grandeur of the ballroom. She placed the trophy on the kitchen counter, its presence a quiet reminder of everything that had just happened. Turning to Jake, she found him standing by the door, looking hesitant for the first time. "You don't have to go," she said softly, surprising herself with the words. Jake's eyes met hers, the weight of the moment settling between them. He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "Are you sure?" Claire nodded, her heart pounding. "Stay." The walls she'd kept up for so long began to crumble as Jake cupped her face, his touch gentle but sure. Their lips met in a kiss that carried the weight of everything they hadn't said, the connection they'd built over weeks of shared struggles and triumphs. It was electric yet tender, the culmination of unspoken feelings neither had dared to voice until now. The night passed in a blur of laughter, whispered confessions, and the kind of closeness that felt both new and inevitable. Jake's arms around her felt like home. In as long as she could remember, Claire allowed herself to let go completely. The morning sunlight filtered through Claire's apartment, warm and golden, brushing over the rumpled covers and the trophy glinting faintly on her kitchen counter. She stirred beneath the blankets, her senses slowly returning as the smell of fresh coffee reached her. Stretching, she blinked her eyes open to see Jake sitting on the edge of the bed, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Morning," he said softly, offering her one. His smile was gentle but tinged with something deeper, a quiet sincerity that made her chest tighten. Claire sat up, the blanket slipping to her lap as she accepted the mug. "Good morning," she replied, her voice still groggy. She took a sip, the warmth of the coffee soothing as she tucked her legs beneath her. Jake leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he spoke. "Last night, it wasn't just about the competition for me," he began, his voice low and steady. "I don't think I realized how much I'd been holding back until now." Claire tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, his lips curving into a small, almost self-conscious smile. "After I lost everything, my career, my confidence, I convinced myself it was safer not to let anyone in. I told myself I didn't need anyone, that I was better off on my own." He looked at her, his expression softening. "But you've changed that." Claire's chest tightened as she set her mug down on the nightstand. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of the blanket as she listened, her heart pounding faintly in her ears. Jake leaned closer, his eyes locked on hers. "I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to hold back, not when I feel this way about you. I want to be here, with you. To figure out what this is and what it could be." He paused, his voice quiet but sure. "But it's not just about what I want. What about you, Claire? How do you feel?" The vulnerability in his question caught her off guard, but in a way that felt freeing. She glanced down at their hands, which had found each other without her even realizing it, his fingers brushing against hers. She swallowed hard, then spoke. "I've spent so much of my life trying to be what other people needed me to be, what Evelyn needed me to be, that I forgot to ask myself what I wanted." She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "But with you, I feel like I can finally just be me. And that's what I want. To stop holding back. To see where this goes." Jake's lips curved into a wide smile, relief and happiness lighting his face. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "Then let's see where it takes us." For a moment, the air between them was quiet and electric, filled with something both new and inevitable. The sunlight seemed warmer, the room brighter, as if the world outside had faded away, leaving only the two of them in this moment. The faint sound of the coffee machine sputtering broke the silence, and Jake laughed as he stood, stretching his arms over his head. "Okay," he said with a teasing grin, "Step 1, pancakes. No better way to start whatever this is." Claire laughed, tossing the blanket aside as she followed him into the kitchen. They moved in an easy rhythm, Jake flipping pancakes with dramatic flair while Claire sliced fruit and rolled her eyes at his antics. The scent of warm batter and freshly brewed coffee filled the small apartment, wrapping around them like a comforting hug. At the table, they sat across from each other, their plates piled high with pancakes and berries. As they ate, their conversation flowed naturally, alternating between playful teasing and deeper reflections on the night before. "I still can't believe I did it," Claire said, shaking her head. "A few weeks ago, I would have laughed if someone told me I'd be standing on a stage with a trophy in my hands." Jake grinned, leaning back in his chair. "I never doubted you. Well, except for that time you almost tripped over your own feet during warm-ups." She laughed, throwing a napkin at him. "I'm pretty sure you doubted me plenty." "Not for a second," he said, his tone softening. "You were incredible, Claire. And not just on stage. The strength you showed these past few weeks, it's inspiring." Her cheeks flushed, and she toyed with her fork, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jake reached across the table, his hand finding hers. "You could have. But I'm glad I got to be part of it." Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else faded again. The hum of the city outside, the ticking of the clock on the wall, none of it mattered. It was just them, the start of something neither had expected but both were ready to embrace. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn sat in her sprawling penthouse, her phone in hand and her coffee growing cold on the table beside her. Her expression was sharp as she scrolled through the morning headlines, each one singing the same tune. Evelyn Hartwell's bold decision, a true mentor who let her assistant shine. Claire Sullivan's star rises, thanks to Evelyn Hartwell's support. The irony was almost laughable. Evelyn, who had banked on Claire's failure to salvage her reputation, was now being praised for her supposed generosity. The media had spun the story into a glowing narrative, and public opinion had shifted dramatically. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. She hated the idea of bringing Claire back, but the alternative, losing the goodwill she'd gained, was far worse. Claire was in the middle of tidying up the dishes from their cozy breakfast when her phone buzzed insistently on the counter. She glanced at the screen and froze. The name Evelyn Hartwell flashed across it like a warning signal. Jake, standing nearby, noticed her expression and raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to answer that?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter. Claire sighed, drying her hands on a dish towel. "I don't know. After everything that happened, I'm not sure I want to." Jake crossed his arms, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Well, it's either going to be an apology or something about how she's still the center of the universe." Claire laughed despite herself, shaking her head. "Probably both." She picked up the phone, bracing herself as she hit the green button. "Hello?" Evelyn's voice came through, smooth and polished as always, but with a faint edge of urgency. "Claire, darling. I've been meaning to call you. I wanted to congratulate you again on your unexpected success." Claire's grip on the phone tightened. She could hear the calculated tone beneath Evelyn's words, but she stayed quiet, letting her boss continue. "The competition was a marvelous showcase," Evelyn went on. "And, as I'm sure you've noticed, the media has been very kind to both of us. Naturally, this has opened up some opportunities. I believe it would be mutually beneficial for you to return to your position." Claire blinked, caught off guard. "You're offering me my job back?" "Of course," Evelyn said, her tone airy. "With an appropriate adjustment to your compensation, of course. I'm prepared to offer you a significant pay increase and, let's say, better conditions. You'll have more autonomy and fewer tasks like, well, the competition." Claire's instinct was to say no immediately, but she stopped herself. "I'll think about it," she said instead. "But if we're going to discuss this, it has to be on my terms." Evelyn paused, clearly not used to negotiating from a position of less power. "Fine. Come to the office tomorrow. We'll discuss it." Claire hung up and set the phone down with a sigh. Jake was watching her, his expression unreadable. So, what did she say? She wants me back, Claire said, crossing her arms. With better pay and conditions. Jake tilted his head, studying her. And what do you want? The question caught her off guard. I don't know. Part of me doesn't want to go back at all. But the money would help, and at least this time, I'd have some control. Jake nodded, stepping closer. You don't have to decide right now. But just remember, you don't owe her anything. You've already proven you can stand on your own. The next day, Claire walked into Evelyn's office with her shoulders squared and her chin high. The familiar space felt different now, as though she were seeing it through new eyes. Evelyn sat behind her desk, perfectly composed, though Claire noticed the faint tension in her jaw. Claire, Evelyn said smoothly, gesturing for her to sit. I'm glad you came. Claire sat, folding her hands in her lap. You said you wanted to discuss terms. Evelyn smiled tightly, clearly not accustomed to being the one negotiating. Yes. As I mentioned, I'm prepared to offer a significant pay increase, along with fewer hours and a more manageable workload. Claire didn't hesitate. I have my own terms. A 30% increase in salary, set hours, no more late-night calls or last-minute emergencies, and the ability to refuse tasks that are outside the scope of my role. Including anything like the dance competition. Evelyn's smile faltered, her fingers tapping against the desk. That's a bold ask. Claire met her gaze steadily. It's non-negotiable. Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. Fine. But let's be clear, this arrangement works as long as it's mutually beneficial. I expect you to continue meeting the high standards I've come to associate with you. Claire resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Of course. The meeting ended with a handshake, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn saw her return as temporary, a stopgap to manage her reputation while the media frenzy continued. That evening, back at her apartment, Claire relayed the meeting to Jake as they sat together on the couch. He listened intently, his brow furrowed. It sounds like she's just biding her time, Jake said, leaning back. You know she's going to find a reason to cut you loose as soon as she thinks she can. Claire sighed. I know. But at least this way, I'm calling the shots for now. Jake reached for her hand, his touch warm and grounding. You have so much more to offer than working for someone like Evelyn. Have you thought about looking for something new? Something that actually values your talent? Claire hesitated, his words stirring something inside her. I guess I haven't really thought about what's next. It's just hard to imagine starting over. Jake's thumb brushed against her knuckles. You've already started over. You stood on that stage and proved you're more than anyone thought. You're stronger than you realize, Claire. Don't let Evelyn hold you back. His words stayed with her long after he left that night, echoing in her mind as she thought about the path ahead. Claire walked back into Evelyn's office on her first day with a mix of resolve and unease. The terms she had set were clear, but knowing Evelyn, those boundaries would be tested sooner rather than later. Still, she had made her decision, and she intended to stick to it, for now. She pushed open the door, greeted by the familiar hum of the office and Evelyn's ever-impeccable facade. Good morning, Claire, Evelyn said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Glad to have you back. I trust you're ready to dive in. Claire nodded, though she felt the undercurrent in Evelyn's tone. Absolutely. The morning passed quickly, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Evelyn's requests came with a subtle edge, small tasks framed as critical that were beneath Claire's role but wrapped in enough urgency to make refusing seem petty. By lunchtime, Claire realized it wasn't her imagination. Evelyn was chipping away at her position, undermining her authority in ways that weren't overt but were undeniably strategic. In the break room, Colin approached her with a knowing look. She's testing you, he said, keeping his voice low. Trying to push you until you either quit or mess up enough for her to justify firing you. Claire sighed, leaning against the counter. I figured as much. You've got options, Colin added. You're too good to stick around and deal with this. Claire smiled faintly but didn't respond. She had been feeling that same pull, but hearing it from someone else gave it weight. She returned to her desk, determined to focus on her work, but her phone buzzed with an unexpected email that made her heart skip. The message was from a prestigious arts organization, known for supporting creative talent and hosting some of the city's most renowned cultural events. They had seen her performance at the competition and were impressed, offering her a position to help organize and curate a new dance outreach program. Her pulse quickened as she read the details. The role would allow her to combine her love of dance with her organizational skills, creating opportunities for others while doing something she was passionate about. It was everything she hadn't realized she'd been looking for. That evening, she met Jake at their favorite diner, sliding into the booth across from him. The warmth of his smile eased the tension in her shoulders. You look like you've got something big on your mind, he said, leaning forward. Claire hesitated, then handed him her phone with the email open. Jake read it, his grin widening as he looked up at her. Claire, this is amazing. Are you going to take it? I don't know, she admitted. It's such a big change. And what if I'm not ready for something like this? Jake set the phone down, his expression earnest. You're more than ready. This is exactly the kind of opportunity you deserve. Don't let fear hold you back. She smiled at him, his confidence in her bolstering her own. I'll think about it. The next few days at work only solidified her decision. Evelyn's attempts to sabotage her grew bolder, from vague criticisms during meetings to suddenly reassigning projects Claire had already begun. By the end of the week, Claire knew she couldn't stay. She sent her resignation email late Friday evening, keeping it professional but firm. When she walked into Evelyn's office the next morning, her boss greeted her with a tight-lipped smile. So, Evelyn said, tapping her pen against her desk. You've decided to move on. I have, Claire said simply. I appreciate the opportunities I've had here, but it's time for me to pursue something new. Evelyn's smile faltered, frustration flashing in her eyes before she masked it. Well, I'm sure you'll do fine wherever you end up, she said dismissively. We'll manage here without you. Claire didn't rise to the bait, keeping her tone polite. I'm confident you will. As she left Evelyn's office for the last time, Claire felt an unexpected lightness. She was finally free. Her new job started the following week, and it was everything she had hoped for. The arts organization welcomed her with open arms, and Claire quickly found herself immersed in a world of creativity and collaboration. She worked with talented dancers, developing programs that brought art to underserved communities, and every day felt like she was building something meaningful. Jake was her constant support, their relationship blossoming in the newfound freedom they both shared. They spent their evenings together, sometimes dancing in her living room, other times simply enjoying the quiet comfort of each other's company. Their connection deepened with every passing day, and Claire found herself dreaming of a future that felt both exciting and attainable. Meanwhile, Evelyn's carefully curated public image began to unravel. Without Claire's steadying presence, small cracks in her operations became visible, and whispers about her abrasive management style started to circulate. The media, once enamored with her supposed generosity, began to question whether her actions were as altruistic as they had seemed. Evelyn, recognizing the shift, attempted to reach out to Claire, inviting her for coffee under the guise of reconciliation. Claire accepted, out of courtesy more than curiosity. I've been hearing great things about your new role, Evelyn said, her tone clipped but attempting warmth. It seems like you've really found your place. I have, Claire said with a polite smile, keeping her responses measured. Evelyn shifted in her seat, her frustration barely concealed. I wanted to say that, despite our differences, I always recognized your potential. I hope there are no hard feelings. Claire met her gaze evenly. I appreciate that, Evelyn. I've moved on, and I'm happy where I am. Evelyn's smile tightened, but she said nothing more. Claire left the meeting feeling a strange sense of closure. Evelyn's attempts to save face didn't matter anymore. Claire was finally in control of her own story. As weeks turned into months, Claire's work flourished, and so did her relationship with Jake. They became true partners, both on and off the dance floor, building a life filled with love, creativity, and mutual respect. Claire often thought back to where she had started, grateful for the journey that had led her to this moment. Evelyn, meanwhile, faded further into the background, her influence waning as her reputation continued to erode. Claire didn't dwell on it, choosing instead to focus on the bright, open future ahead of her.